Hello, everyone. It's Renée Cormier from the Fractional Referral Network. I have Bryan Olson with us. Today, we're talking about HR drivers and how fractionals can leverage HR strategies to drive business growth for their clients. Bryan Olson is an HR CHRO, a fractional CHRO with a background in law as well. And he specializes in mergers and acquisitions, so helping companies get through the people component of a merger and acquisition. So welcome, Bryan. Very nice to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Renee. Appreciate it.
Did I miss anything in that intro?
I think you got the highlights. I also have a background in finance, as it turns out. So
Oh,
finance and then legal, and spent the last 20 years in HR. And I think saying M&A is my superpower is probably right. But I think today we're going to talk about strategic HR probably more broadly than that.
okay. Very good. Very good. So, can you start off by telling us a little bit about this idea of using HR strategies to drive business results? Because people think about, sales or marketing as driving business results. How does HR figure into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think HR is often thought of as a cost center. I think, like you said, people don't think of it necessarily as driving revenues, but you can look at HR really through two different lenses. I'd say one of them is more of the administrative HR. I think those are the things that people are thinking about. It's things like compensation, benefits, onboarding, hiring, right? It's getting people in the door, getting them working, getting them paid, putting them in a position where they can do the work that they need to do, all very valuable, important functions. They have to be done, and HR tends to handle most of those things. HR can also, though, be strategic, and I'd say the strategic HR piece of it is really the other lens to look at it through. And those types of things are really where you're going to drive business results. So those are the types of things that tend to make the business more profitable, more effective. A few examples are things like organizational design. So how do you structure your business? Who reports to who? What are their roles and responsibilities? Is it a matrixed organization, right? Is it geographically aligned? All of those things will impact how the business operates, how the work gets done. And it's a lot more than just building an org chart and putting names in those boxes, right? It's things like workforce planning. How many people do you need to staff in each location? Are there better ways to do that? Are there more efficient ways to do it? How many supervisors do you need, right? Those are data-driven decisions that have a big impact on profitability. And then things like how do you attract the right people, right? What's your employee value proposition? What is it that you're putting out there into the world, into the workforce that causes people to want to come work for you? And by the way, are those things sort of driving, attracting the type of people that you want to have, right? Is your employment brand speaking to the right people, right? That employment brand should really attract the employees that you want and maybe turn off the people that you don't want. They'll be less interested in coming, right? So all of those things also then tie into culture. They tie into employee engagement. They impact things like employee retention and development. All of those more strategic pieces of HR are really what's driving the business forward, right? So just to give you an example of the kind of impact that that can have, one of the biggest clients that I've worked with over time had really just had this administrative version of HR before we started working together. And, that people were getting paid, people were getting hired, they were moving things forward. But we did a lot of work in the space of org design and mission and vision and values and employment branding and culture and sort of changing the way that we brought people into the organization. And what he said to me a couple of months into it, he said, Bryan, HR here has accomplished more in the last 4 months than it did in the prior 4 years before we started on this strategic piece of HR. So I think it really can have a big impact if you're focused on the strategic parts of HR.
Yeah. So, to what extent do things like company culture and employee engagement drive business results?
Yeah, they certainly have an impact. I think the challenge can be that they're pretty hard to measure, right? So it's hard to know based on culture whether you're really driving those business results forward or not. But I think it's pretty clear they have an impact. I think when you do talk about culture, it's more than just kumbaya, right? It's not are people happy here and are they excited to be here? Those are important pieces of it for sure. But your culture could be a culture of process improvement. It could be a culture of customer focus. It could be a culture of delivering results. whatever culture you've established there is just going to drive your overall effectiveness as a business. And you can use strategic HR tools to help drive and reinforce those things, right? So you can set up your HR compensation plans. You can set up your performance review process so that they are really focused on the pieces of the culture that you want to drive forward, and you're rewarding and recognizing people for helping build and drive that culture. Overall, I'd say the more happy and engaged employees are, the more productive that they're going to be. So obviously that's an important piece of it. But it's a business that we have to run, and you've got to balance, the employee needs versus company needs, and try to build that culture where you can effectively go after both of them. One of the probably most important places to focus when you're doing that is to look at your first level of managers, right? Because when you look at studies that have been done on employee engagement, they often come back and find that the single most impactful factor in whether a person is engaged at work or not is their immediate supervisor, right? So it's the relationship with their boss. If they have a good relationship, a good working relationship with their boss, they tend to be pretty engaged and pretty happy about the company. If they don't like their boss, they're probably not going to love the company, right? I think it's pretty intuitive, but it's incredible how much that one factor really has an impact on that sort of overall engagement. And what tends to happen in most companies is the people who are good individual contributors, right? The people who are good at the job that they were doing get promoted to be a manager, right? They didn't necessarily have manager skills. We didn't necessarily train them to be managers. We just assumed they were good at that job, so they're going to be good at supervising people doing that job.
Yes.
Often not the case, right? So when you're trying to build culture and reinforce culture, and particularly when you're trying to drive engagement, one of the first places to look at is that first level supervisor. Are you picking the right people that have the right skills to lead people? Are you training and developing them to be able to do that? Or were they just good at the job that they did before?
Yeah, and you see that a lot with salespeople.
Yeah.
Being pulled. The best salespeople end up being sales managers, and then sales drop.
Well, and the
It's sort
interesting
of
thing
it's so
about that,
counterintuitive, but it happens all the
right?
time.
Well, and sales is a great example of it, right? I know a lot of people who love being salespeople. Like they're doing it because it's their passion. It's what they're good at. It's a great fit for them. Managing salespeople is an entirely different thing, and a lot of them want nothing to do with it, right? It's not what drives them. It's not what excites them, and so they're not going to be as good at it.
So what metrics can HR use to drive business results, or to get a better understanding? What are the how do they tie that in?
Yeah. Yeah, metrics in HR are one of those things that people are always looking for, right? Because we talked before about employee engagement and how it's kind of hard to measure and it's difficult to see how it drives results. I think intuitively people know that if the workforce is more engaged, you're going to have a more effective, probably more profitable business, but it's hard to put a number on that. And so I think often people think of HR as more of the soft side of the business, that it's sort of hard to pin down how it's really going to drive things forward. They see it often as just a necessary cost, right? As a cost center.
Yes.
But there are indeed measurements that you can look at, metrics that you can apply in the HR space that will help you tie directly to overall business results, right? So there are a few. The first I can think of are labor cost ratios, right? So for example, your labor cost per revenue dollars. So for every $100 you made in revenues, how many dollars did you spend on the people to bring in those revenues? And it's a fairly easy measurement to do. You look at the total revenues that you brought in from all sources, and you look at the total costs associated with all of your employees. So their compensation, benefits, taxes, perks, all of that. And you just divide one number by the other, and you get an idea of what percentage of your revenue is going to your labor force. And the right number there varies by industry. And so there are benchmark data out there that you can go and get to figure out what should that ratio be for a retail company? What should that retail be for a construction company, right? What should those ratios look like? And make sure that you're being at least competitive with those in your industry, and hopefully that your labor cost ratios are lower than your competitors so that you're more profitable. One of the things that I'll do is when managers say they need more people on their team, we'll look at the labor cost per revenue for their particular location, right? Or for their business unit to make sure they're hitting a particular number before we'll give them more headcount, right? It's a way to sort of help determine when you should actually bring in more people and when you shouldn't, right? So that's the first one I can think of. Another one would be turnover rates or turnover ratios. I think that's one that a lot of people look at. I think
Yeah.
everybody knows that it costs money to hire people, right? When you let someone go, you got to go find a new employee. You're going to do that either by using your own people to go find them, or you're going to hire a recruiter. You're probably posting jobs on LinkedIn and Indeed. You've got to interview those people. They may have to go through licensing or background checks, and then you've got to train them up and you got to onboard them and get them a new computer and set up their email. All of these things cost money. And there's been a bunch of studies done on this, and the numbers are all over the place, right? So some of them
Yeah.
will tell you it costs $2,500 to bring on a new employee. Some of them will say it costs you $25,000 to bring on an employee. There's a wide range of what those studies have found. I don't know what the right actual number is. I've run it for a few companies and it's in that range, maybe sort of lower to middle end of that range as we've sort of done the analysis. But I think the point is there's a cost to it, right? You're
Yes.
gonna have less cost if you're hiring people less often. And at the same time, if people are quitting less or you're letting them go less because they didn't perform, then you're hiring the right people, right? So that also is going to help you drive your business forward because you don't have the cost of hiring the right people. You've got the right people in the company doing the work. And so that's probably one of the primary metrics that HR tends to look at, or that businesses tend to look at for HR is sort of some version of turnover rate. And you can actually go a lot of sort of different directions with that. So let's just take that one and maybe dig a little bit into it. I've got one client that's actually focused specifically on what we're referring to as quick quitters, right? So these are new hire employees who leave within 90 days. This particular industry happens to have a very high turnover rate, just industry wide. And so, we sort of decided to focus on this area, realizing how much it was costing us to have people come to work, be there for a couple of weeks and leave, and then us have to go and backfill them, right? It was becoming really quite a drain on profitability. And so first we started doing the analysis and measuring, right? Like what is the rate of quick quitters? Does it vary from one location to another? Like where are the pain points? And let's go jump into those and figure out what's going on, right? So we've dug into it to figure out what's driving it. And then we're solving that problem by doing better onboarding, so better training, better setting of expectations. We've done exit interviews to talk to people that they're leaving to figure out why they left so quickly so that we can learn from the mistakes we made and not make those mistakes again. And then we've used that to sort of adjust our new hire process, our interviewing process, our selection process, and our onboarding process. So there's a bunch of different metrics you can use, but those two are probably the most directly impactful.
I think there are a lot of hidden costs in turnover as well. Like how many customers did you lose? And you don't know this. This is hard to figure out because that front-facing person didn't have the necessary information to service the customer fully. Just pissing people off because you don't know all the policies and the procedures, or you made a mistake that cost the company a lot of money, whether you're on an assembly line or because you didn't know
Yeah.
something that takes time to know. You can't learn it all in a week. It takes, up to 12 months or even longer, depending on the job, to get through that knowledge gap. So maybe
Yeah.
like some of those big numbers that you're getting on the cost of turnover is uh, also incorporating some of the hidden costs that are harder to track and harder to really figure out.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm sure that's how they get to their bigger numbers. And look, it's justifiable to look at it that way. I think everything you said there is exactly right. And you can even add to it and say if you've got a high turnover of your employees, that's going to impact your culture, right? Whatever culture you're trying to drive, right? If you want a customer-centered culture, if you want a results-driven culture, if you want a process improvement-driven culture, whatever type of culture you're trying to drive, if you're just getting people in and then teaching them up on how to do that, and then they leave, then you got to train somebody else up on how to do it again, right? And so it's another example of how there really are
Slows everybody down.
additional costs that are hard to measure, right? That are impacted by
Yeah.
turnover.
Yeah. So what role should HR play in delivering those metrics to business for
Yeah,
business results?
I think it depends on the metric and it depends a little bit on the business, right? So I think it's easy to look at an HR metrics and point to HR and say you own it, right? So there are certainly metrics that are largely on HR. How long did it take you to fill a job, right? Is something that's largely within the parameters of HR to own most of the pieces of that. What was the quality of hire, right? How good was that hire that you brought in? What percentage of your employees are sticking around for more than a year, right? I think those types of metrics fall fairly squarely on HR, right? HR should be responsible for those. A lot of the other types of metrics that we're talking about, right? Labor cost ratios, turnover rates, HR plays a role, but so does the manager, right? So does the operating team, so does the business owner, so all the way from the top, right? The president of a company, the CEO does a lot to set the culture and to set the expectations. And so those are the types of metrics that really probably should be owned more by the business than by HR. But in my view, the best HR people still feel ownership for those, right? Because a strong HR leader should be a strong business leader, right? Should be partnering with leaders of the organizations, with managers, with leaders in operations. The leadership team as a whole should own those types of results because if those metrics are driving your overall performance, everybody should care about them. Everybody should own them. And to some extent, everybody has, a piece of making them happen.
Okay, so what are the times in a company's life cycle when they should really focus on HR strategy as opposed to random acts of human resources? We say in marketing, random acts of marketing. So random
Okay.
acts of HR,
Can I steal that? I like
managing
it.
the benefits. Or
That's a good one. I'm gonna have to use that one again. Look, I mean, really, you should be using strategic HR all the time, right? Because it's going to be driving the business forward. It's sort of the whole point is you need to do the blocking and tackling of HR. You need to do the hiring and the onboarding and the compensation, the benefits. Again, those are important, but what's really going to drive you forward is that strategic HR. That having been said, there are specific times in a company's life cycle when it is more important, right? If you bring in a new CEO, probably a time to have a strong HR leader sort of help with that adjustment, with the cultural changes that are going to happen with that, with the making the culture adjustments that CEO likely wants to make. If your business is going through some sort of major restructuring, right? There are likely going to be a bunch of layoffs, right? And if layoffs happen, you really should have a strong strategic HR person help you do that because there's a right way and a wrong way to do layoffs. And you'll see plenty of examples on the internet out there about how it's been done the wrong way, for example, by text or email or whatever it may be. When you do things like that, that's going to have an impact on your ability to hire people down the road. It's going to have an impact on how likely the people you currently have are to stay because they may not trust you anymore, right? And so it's one of those things that, offboarding employees in the right way, right? So not just layoffs, but if you have to let somebody go for performance, right? If somebody did a terrible job, there's no reason to be vindictive, to be mean, to be unkind, to be anything other than professional because there's no reason to. It gains you nothing in
yeah,
business. But if you treat somebody poorly on the way out the door, then you're disrupting your own reputation as a company, as an employer. And so it's one of those things like I think the way that you let people leave the company or help them leave the company has as big an impact on your ability to attract and retain employees as just about anything else out there. And I think it's one that's often misoverlooked and
yes.
done unwell. And
Yeah,
then maybe one other I
I
would add is
agree.
M&A. It's the one we talked about at the beginning,
Yes.
right? If you're going through a corporate transaction, if you're being acquired, if you're acquiring someone else, studies have found that the primary reason that deals fail after they've closed, right? So you announce a deal, you go through all the steps, you close the deal, and then you go through some process of integration, right? Where you're bringing those two companies together, looking at your overall results, and either those were positive or they were negative. In the cases where they were negative, the biggest impact tends to be ineffective people integration. Did you bring the cultures together, right? Were there two entirely different ways of making decisions at the two companies that was never brought together? Did you establish clear roles and responsibilities, right? Like who owns what decision? Who has the authority to, who do they have to talk to before they make that decision? You know, who do they have to form? Who do they have to consult with before they do it? So those people issues in an M&A transaction are huge. And so I'd say that's another area where you really need to bring in strategic HR. So it's really, you know, times of major transition, right? It's M&A, it's leadership changes, it's restructuring. Those sorts of things are probably when it's most critical.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, going back to your earlier point about how people are dismissed, they, a lot of companies really underestimate the power of the word of mouth, even within, you know, the workforce. They think about it with their customers, they don't think about it with their employees. But I've heard of lots of companies in my lifetime that are horrible to work for.
Yeah.
And so would I apply for a job there? No.
Well, look, I
You
would
know,
agree with that. And I
yeah.
would extend it beyond that and say social media makes it even
Oh,
more of a challenge, right? You've got things out there like Glassdoor and Twitter and LinkedIn where people post all kinds of things about their employer without seeming to really even care what the employer or people there may think about it, right? They're just posting their views. And even things that you think are internal aren't always internal, right? So I was at a company where we had an internal social media platform. We made a pretty significant change to a benefit that impacted some of our longest serving employees of the company. They were not happy about it. They took to social media and they got enough sort of momentum behind that that eventually somebody shared those social media posts with a reporter, and we ended up on TV and in the newspaper for, you know, what had been sort of an internal issue, right? So I think you have to think pretty hard about all those kinds of things because you have
yeah.
very little control over what your employees are going to say. And they have a lot more ability to sort of reach the general public than they did maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's always a good policy. If you have a big workforce and a big HR department, you should probably also have a PR person on board.
Agreed.
Anyway, so what advice would you give fractional executives about, you know, how they can help clients uh, leverage HR strategies?
Sure, sure. So look, the first one is we covered really just a minute ago, right? If you're working with
Yes.
a company that's going through transition, right? So if they're going through M&A or leadership change or restructuring, that's a time to bring in somebody that's got the expertise to help with those transitions from an HR perspective. And I think the nice thing about that is really that is sort of fractional work that would be done there, right? These aren't long-term expenses. Often it's somebody to come in for a finite period of time to make that transition. And then that point you decide, you know, do you need to bring in someone full-time for HR that can do that strategic stuff, or is it somebody that can do it part-time for an extended period of time? Right. But those are where the opportunities arise to really think about it, right? Are those types of transitions. One that I would maybe add to that I didn't talk about that before, if you're a fractional leader and you're working in a company, you've likely got a view to the HR team. And you've probably, you know, worked with enough HR teams in your career that you can have a fairly good idea of, is this a strong HR team or not, right? Are they capable of doing strategic HR or not? And if they're not, you may want to bring in someone to assess and decide whether they are, you know, or to help that organization go through an HR transition. They may need some new talent, they may need a new structure so that you can set up that HR team to be effective and strategic down the road. And then maybe just a couple of other places, maybe one other to focus on is I know a lot of fractionals work with startups. And one of the things that I found working with startups is that they tend to hire a lot of other people first, right? So they're going to bring in a CFO and they're going to bring in a general counsel and they're going to bring in a marketing person and a salesperson. And depending on the industry, probably a handful of other people. And then at some point after they've been doing this for 3 or 4 years, they realized they didn't bring in an HR person, or if they did, it was somebody who was a consultant just doing the administrative HR, right? The hiring, the firing, the benefits, the compensation. And then they realize they have a mess, right? That there's a whole bunch of things in their culture and their structure that just aren't working. And if they had thought about that much earlier in the process, it would have been much less painful and much less costly to fix early on if they had just did it at the beginning than if they waited a couple of years to do it later, right? So it's one to be aware of. I've talked to a number of startup leaders about that once they've experienced what that strategic HR can bring to the table. And I've had several of them say, I wish we'd done this much earlier. We just didn't realize that HR needed to come in earlier.
Well, it's funny because people are the foundation of your business, not your product, not your sales, not your marketing. It's your people first, and then everything comes from the people. So it seems very counterintuitive to not include HR at the table.
Yeah, well,
Um,
especially if you've got employees in your organization who are customer facing in some way,
yeah,
shape, or form, right? Like that person to your customer is your company, right?
yes,
That's your culture, that's your product, that's your service. Like you're talking to the company when you're talking to that one employee, and being in a
yes.
position where at least most of your employees are representing the company in the way that you would want them to, is important, right? To driving your overall success as a company and to making sure that what you're putting out there to customers is what you intend to put out there to customers.
Yes. Okay, I'm just going to open up the floor. Doug, I don't know if you're able to show your pretty face or not, but if you have any questions for Bryan or Greg, fire away. Unmute.
I'll jump in. Uh,
Yeah,
this
thank
is
you.
this is this has been really helpful, right? It's good to hear people talk about how critically important not just the human bodies in an organization are, but how they're thought about, how they're treated, how they even get there. In terms of administrative HR, and especially in the startup world, as you talked about, I've seen the same sort of thing happen repeatedly. Uh, Especially in the tech world, tends to be all about the product. And, oftentimes, and Renee, I'm sure you've seen this, they'll have a field of dreams marketing strategy where they just have to build it and people will come. And when that doesn't work out too well, then they realize they need help from folks like me to develop sales strategy and process, right? But ultimately, it takes people. And I absolutely, Bryan, 100% agree that most of the time HR is the afterthought. I mean, it does tend to be sort of like the last thing they think about because all they think about is like, all right, so what kind of a benefit package can we offer, right? And so they hire somebody to go out and figure out like what are we going to offer as benefits? What can we afford to offer, right? And then they kind of they think HR is done at that point, right?
Yeah, and Greg, it's almost backwards, right? The way that they're doing it. Because if you've got a strong strategic HR leader, they can meet with the leader of the organization, understand their needs, understand where they're trying to go, understand their gaps and pain points, and then can help them through organizational design figure out here's the boxes you need, here are the key positions you need, and here's the people you should use. I can help you find the people to fill them, right? Or here's the skills and talents and responsibilities that you need in each of those roles. So it's almost like they start out by doing HR's job without having HR at the table, and then they wonder why 3 years down the road HR isn't working.
Well, and so here's my question for you. When you talked about how um, organizations will tend to promote the people who do the job well into a role of leadership without really developing leadership skills. What's been your experience there? How have you tackled that kind of an issue for folks before?
Yeah, like it's a great question, and it's a fairly common problem, right? I've seen it across industries, across different size companies. It's almost like it's just human nature to do it that way, right?
Right.
And at the
Right.
same time, you're actually trying to you're doing the right thing by the employee, right? You're promoting them because they did a good job. And so that's something you should want to do, right? Promote from within rather than necessarily hire from outside. So a couple of things that we've done in that space. One is we've worked with companies to figure out alternative paths of promotion, right? So law firms are a great example. Law firms have often been up and out, right? The whole idea is I'm going to hire 100 associates so that 20% of them are going to leave, and then I'm going to have 80 second year associates, and I'm going to have when a bunch of them leave, I'm going to have 50 30 years associates. And the whole idea is that by the time you've been there 7 or 8 years, attrition has left you to the point where you got a handful of people to pick from for partner, right? And that model worked in the law firm environment for a long time. But what happened over the last couple of decades is that many of the people who joined law firms have zero interest in being a partner. They want nothing to do with it. They don't want to do the business development. It's not what they want for their career. They may have come to a law firm to work for 3 years to make enough money to pay off a big chunk of their student loans and then go do the job they actually want to do that they needed the law degree for. And so that's an example where we worked with law firms to just completely change in some cases the way that they designed the whole structure of their organization so that they would have one path that was the partner path and one path that was the non-partner path. And on the non-partner path, we still did training and development and sort of help those people get better at what they do and further their skills. And the idea was, well, let's make them happy doing what they want to do, right? And let's all acknowledge they're only going to be here for 3 or 4 years, but what can we each get from each other while they're here? Let's make it beneficial for both the lawyer and the law firm. And a lot of law firms do it that way and have found it, I think, to be very effective, right? So sometimes it's just a structural change like that, right? Figuring out ways to promote people and have career paths for them that aren't necessarily at that manager level, right? So that's the first one. But the second one is, look, sometimes you do just have to hire people into manager roles. You'd rather have somebody who knows your business, knows your product, knows your service than just hiring somebody off the street. So then you actually have to train those people, right? So you've got to have the programs in place and you've got to make sure that you've got a way to deliver those programs, right? So that's sort of the second approach we take. Tends to be one of those sort of two paths, sometimes both of them together.
What I found interesting, and I'd be curious to hear what all of you have to say about this, is that leadership is a skill set, just like anything else. It can be learned, right? And what I've found in my career that has been mostly in strategic B2B sales is that yes, what ends up happening is the best performing rep ends up getting the promotion. And like you said, even when they don't want it, and it's typically a formula for failure. And so even if you have to bring someone from the outside into the organization that has those leadership skills, I've always thought, and this is the salesman's mentality, I'll learn what your business is. It's not a problem, right? I have the skills to be able to be an effective salesperson. Likewise, you can have the skills to be an effective leader and learn the product, learn the service, learn the marketplace. And I think what happens, at least this has been my experience, is that oftentimes leaders at the top of the organization who've been there because they know the product, the service, the marketplace, feel that the greatest value someone has potentially is already having that experience. And they tend to discount this idea that HR should be helping me to find good people to fill the roles and responsibilities. And leadership is one of those. It's one of those things that often, again, I think is just and I think you said this, Renee, as people, we naturally think that if we know how to do a job and do it well, and we've done it for a long time, suddenly now we can help others to do it too. I mean, there's examples all throughout life where sports athletes will have a great career and then suddenly become a coach or a general manager and just be terrible at it. Same for
Yeah.
lawyers.
Because knowing how to do something and knowing how to teach something are two entirely different skills. And so knowing how to lead and knowing how to sell, for example, are two entirely different skills. They're
Yes,
not the same.
100%. 100%.
Yeah, and look, I think you need a mix of internally promoted people and external people, right? Because you want to build a culture that shows you're taking care of your employees, right? That there's going to be
Absolutely.
opportunities for them at your company, that if they're doing well, they're going to get bigger jobs, more responsibility, they're going to continue to learn, stretch, and grow, and ultimately make more money as well, right? So you want to have that in your culture, or you're going to lose all of your top, most talented people. At the same time, if you read books, like the what's it called? The Innovators, I think, which is about, how they came up with the whole concept of building computer programs. I think one of the concepts that was made very clear in that book and some others were that most of the time, innovation in an industry comes from outside of that industry altogether, right? It's people who come in with a fresh set of eyes, who have experience from an entirely different industry, doing things in an entirely different way. And when they come into a new space, they bring that to the table and they just come up with ideas that other people hadn't thought of. So I think you need a mix of both. Like the companies that I've seen that balance this the best tend to focus a little bit more on internal, right? Because they do really want to have plenty of opportunities for their good people. And if they're doing a good job of that and building that culture, they tend to retain them. And so they have to have plenty of opportunities for promotion. But they also, in select key positions where they know they need outside talent, a different point of view, different experience than they have, especially if it's a new role, for example, that was just created, they really know that they need to go outside and bring somebody in who can bring that to the table for them. So they're constantly getting this new batch of fresh ideas.
And I suspect you would think and agree that it's important for the leadership of the organization to communicate that really well with inside the organization so that people don't feel like, oh, geez, Bryan's going to the outside again to hire a leadership position. And, why didn't I get a shot at that job? I mean, I would assume that's a big part of the leader's role, but also it's built into how HR does its job too, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, internal communications plays a piece of that. Sometimes that's a separate department. Sometimes it's under comms. Sometimes it's under HR,
Mm,
right?
mm,
But the way that you talk to employees, about that has an impact for sure. And look, it may not necessarily be in an org announcement, right? I just sounded an announcement. I got a new person. This is why we brought him in. But hopefully you're having things like team meetings and town halls where your leaders are
mm.
just talking to people and explaining why you did things the way you did them. You're taking Q&A, and hopefully when you do that, you have an HR leader standing by your side, because my experience has been bad things happen when the leader tries to answer HR questions. It's just usually not a good idea.
I have been in several of those. You get the CEO and the CFO up on the stage. Where's HR?
Yeah.
If I could add a comment, it's Doug here, and I'm traveling this afternoon, so I don't have my visual on, but great discussion. Excellent points made by Greg and Bryan. I did want to comment because I think, in addition to Greg's comment that you can teach some of the operational management kind of skills, I think you can also teach and develop leadership skills. And I think it starts with an understanding about why some of these people skills or soft skills, if you want to call them that, are important, how they impact the business. And then I would say giving them support and, training and development to understand why it's so important, but also how to understand employee needs and support employee needs so that they feel valued and appreciated and loyal to the organization. So just a comment there. Thanks.
Very good,
Yeah,
Doug.
and thanks, Doug. And I agree. I think you can teach leadership skills. I think you can also measure leadership skills for what that's worth, right? So one of the things you'll often find for leaders, particularly more senior in the organization, is they figure, I've been promoted a bunch of times. I've been doing this for decades. I must be really good at everything I do, right? And why would I not be? Because what I've done so far got me here. One thing that can be very effective is 360-degree feedback, right? Where each
Right.
leader is getting written feedback from the people who they report to, from their peers, from the people within their organization, answering a bunch of questions about things like communication and leadership skills. And often there are gaps between how a person perceives that they're doing and how the people around them feel like they're doing. And those can be very effective tools for leaders, for them to continue to learn, stretch, and grow, and maybe identify the areas where they need to get training, right? Where they need help developing a particular leadership skill, right? Because usually at that level, it's less about teaching broad-based leadership skills, and it's more about identifying gaps that leaders have and training them up on those weaker areas so that they're no longer weaker areas.
So what are your favorite tools from an HR perspective? What, like when you begin work with a company, are there particular tools that you like to use, or resources that you like to use to help sort of figure out what the gaps are, or fill in gaps, or things like that?
Yeah, a couple come to mind. I'd say one of them is a culture assessment, and you sort of need somebody external to do this to sort of get the real skinny, where you have a handful of questions and you talk to people at a bunch of different levels across the organization, and you just get a feel for what it's like to work there, right? What's working? What isn't working? What is the culture here? How are decisions made? You know, are people led by fear, right? Are they afraid to make mistakes? Are people comfortable sharing new ideas and sharing problems? And there can often be pretty significant disconnects between what a leader thinks those answers are going to be and what those answers actually are. And so that tends to be a good tool just to help identify the issues that you know you need to go after, and to help maybe get a clearer picture on what's actually going on. And then once you've done that, or organizational design for me is a hugely important strategic HR tool. There are too many instances of people outside of HR building org charts, putting names on a box, and that's sort of how the organization gets built. The way you structure an organization is one of the most important things you can do, right? It's going to determine whether work gets done or not. It's going to create pain points and handoff issues, or solve pain points and handoff issues. And every time you make a change one place, you probably created a problem somewhere else, right? And no org design is perfect. Every one of them is going to optimize something and sub-optimize something else. And working with leaders to figure out what are those trade-offs that they want to make is particularly rewarding for me, and I think drives a lot of impact in the business. And it's gotten to the point with some clients that I've done a lot of work in this area, where they sort of go to org design as the solution for everything, right? Every time there's an issue, well, we may have an org design problem, so let's get on the org design couch and figure this out. And I think part of the reason they do that is because when it's done right, the org design process is really a guided facilitation where an HR leader will help an operational leader or a functional leader understand what are the gaps and pain points and challenges that are happening within their current structure, and what's working well, and how can you make adjustments to that structure to make it more impactful, more effective, and just better for the people who are in those jobs, because they have more clarity around their roles and responsibilities, and you're sure to get the right people in the right jobs.
Very good. Anybody else have any questions? All good? Well, there we go. I think we can wrap it up. Thank you very much, Bryan. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we call it a day?
Just a thanks for the invite, and a thanks for their participation. I thought it was a great discussion, and enjoyed the time to chat with everybody.
We don't need a lot of people to have a great discussion. I discovered this about our fractional referral network. I do these weekly calls, and I've never had one that I hated. So that's a good thing. So thank you all very much. I will end this meeting, and Bryan, I'll catch you in our follow-up meeting. Okay.
Sounds good. Thanks, everybody.
Oh,
Thank you all.
bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Okay. Bye.